It was a peaceful afternoon in Greenwood Park, a place where many locals come to unwind and escape the hustle of city life. The sun was shining through the trees, and the sound of birds chirping added to the serenity. Little did anyone know that this seemingly perfect day would take a shocking turn. An elderly woman, Mrs. Martha Johnson, sat quietly on a stone bench, lost in her thoughts. Her frail hands gripped the arms of the bench, her graying hair billowing gently in the breeze. Everything was calm until two police officers, Officer Blake and Officer Carter, stormed towards her, shouting accusations. "Ma'am, you need to move along. This park is for everyone, not for loitering," Officer Blake barked. Confused, Mrs. Johnson tried to explain, but before she could finish her sentence, Officer Carter grabbed her arm and roughly yanked her to her feet. She stumbled, falling to the ground. The officers continued to be harsh, handcuffing her despite her protests. A small crowd began to gather, some pulling out their phones, recording the scene, but no one intervened. As the situation escalated, the crowd grew tense. Among the onlookers was none other than Mike Tyson, a legendary boxer, who had been relaxing after a training session. Hearing the commotion, Mike's sharp eyes darted toward the bench where Mrs. Johnson was being mistreated. His blood began to boil. His past experiences with injustice flashed before his eyes, and he knew he couldn't stand by. "What's going on here?" Mike asked as he approached the officers, his voice calm but firm. Officer Blake turned to him, his expression annoyed. "This doesn't concern you, buddy. Keep walking." Mike's fists clenched involuntarily, but he remained composed. He had witnessed enough injustice in his life to know when something wasn't right, and what he was seeing now wasn't right. The elderly woman, with her hunchback and trembling hands, didn't deserve this. He took a few steps closer, his gaze fixed on the officers who were now roughly handling the woman, pulling her up without care. "She's done nothing wrong," Mike said, his voice a steady growl. "Why are you treating her like this?" Officer Carter scoffed. "She's just sitting there, taking up space. She needs to move." He tugged at Mrs. Johnson's arm, making her wince in pain. "I don't care if she's taking up space," Mike retorted, his voice rising slightly. "She's an elderly woman, for heaven's sake. Show some respect." By now, a small crowd had gathered, some murmuring in agreement, others looking on nervously. A few people were recording, but no one dared to intervene. The tension in the air was palpable. The officers, meanwhile, seemed more annoyed than ever. "She's not a threat," Mike shouted, stepping closer to the officers. "You're using way too much force." Officer Blake glared at Mike. "You need to back off. Now." But Mike wasn't backing down. He had been in the ring with the toughest fighters, and none of them had ever intimidated him the way these two officers were trying to. He wasn't afraid. His voice remained calm but unwavering. "You don't get to treat people like this. Not while I'm here." At that moment, Officer Carter moved as if to push Mike away, but Mike stood firm. He didn't flinch. The crowd, now sensing that something was about to happen, became more alert. Some people started whispering among themselves, recognizing the boxer who had just stepped into the situation. "Mike Tyson," one person muttered. Mike's reputation had preceded him. Even the officers, who had initially dismissed him, now seemed to pause for a second. The thought of an encounter with a public figure like Mike Tyson wasn't something they wanted. Blake glanced nervously at Carter, who looked like he was ready to lash out. "What's the big deal?" Carter snapped. "She's causing a disturbance." Mike shook his head, his eyes steely. "She's not causing any disturbance. You are." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and some people began to voice their opinions, siding with Mike. "Let her go," someone shouted. "She didn't do anything wrong." The officers began to feel the weight of the attention they were getting. More and more phones were pointed in their direction, capturing every second of their misstep. Mike knew that at that moment, the power of the public eye was on his side. He wasn't alone in this fight. "Look around," Mike said to the officers, gesturing to the crowd. "Everyone here sees what you're doing." Officer Blake clenched his jaw but didn't respond, his hands still tightly gripping the cuffs as he tried to force them onto Mrs. Johnson. The elderly woman winced in pain, her fragile body trembling. Mike stepped forward, standing between the officers and Mrs. Johnson, his broad shoulders a shield against the injustice unfolding. "This ends now," Mike said, his voice strong and unwavering. Mike Tyson's act of courage that day in Greenwood Park is a testament to the power of one person's willingness to stand up for what's right. In a world often plagued by injustice, we must all do our part to ensure fairness, equality, and compassion. No matter who we are, where we come from, or how old we are, we all have the power to make a difference. Justice isn't something that just happens. It's something we have to fight for every day. And when we stand together, we can change the world for the better. If this story inspired you, please leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that make a difference. The officers turned toward him, initially unaware of who he was. "This is none of your business," Officer Carter sneered, rolling his eyes. But Mike didn't back down. "I can't stand by and watch this." "She's done nothing wrong," Mike said, his tone unwavering. Officer Blake smirked, clearly annoyed. "Look, buddy, if you don't want trouble, step aside." But Mike remained in place, his stance resolute. "I'm not going anywhere until you let her go." The crowd, now paying attention, murmured in agreement. Mike's presence seemed to embolden them. More voices rose, calling for the officers to release Mrs. Johnson. The officers tried to maintain their authority, but they were visibly rattled by the growing number of people recording and speaking out. Mike's eyes locked with Officer Carter's. "You don't have a reason to arrest her," Mike said. "You're abusing your power." Officer Carter glared back, his hand tightening on his baton. "We're doing our job. You don't know the full story, so stay out of it." But Mike wasn't having it. "You don't get to treat people like this, especially someone who's defenseless. She hasn't done anything wrong." The crowd around them grew larger, and more people started recording. Some shouted out their support, while others demanded justice. As the officers started to feel the pressure, Blake's face grew red with frustration. His jaw clenched as he tried to regain control of the situation. "Move back," Officer Blake barked, waving his arms. "This is a police matter." But the crowd didn't budge. A few people in the front had already begun chanting, "Let her go! Let her go!" The officers could feel the heat mounting, their authority slipping away with every passing second. Mike's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the escalating tension. He knew how to handle himself in difficult situations, whether in the ring or in life. He had faced intimidation before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for what was right. "I'm not going to let this go," Mike said firmly. "She deserves respect, just like everyone else. You're supposed to protect people, not hurt them." The crowd, sensing that something might change, grew louder, more confident. The officers were starting to look uncomfortable under the watchful eyes of so many witnesses. And then, as if the tension wasn't thick enough, a loud siren broke through the noise. The sound of a police car grew closer, and everyone turned as a patrol car skidded to a halt. It was Lieutenant Taylor, Blake and Carter's superior, who had been alerted to the incident. He stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the crowd before locking onto the officers. "What's going on here?" Lieutenant Taylor demanded, his voice commanding attention. Blake quickly turned to Taylor, relief flooding his face. "Sir, we were just handling the situation. This man is interfering with our work." Mike turned toward the lieutenant, his posture unwavering. "I'm just standing up for what's right," Mike said, his voice calm yet firm. "This woman hasn't done anything wrong, and they're treating her like a criminal." Lieutenant Taylor's eyes flicked to the elderly woman still kneeling on the ground, handcuffed, trembling. He took a slow breath, his expression softening as he surveyed the scene. "Is this true?" Taylor asked, directing his question at the officers. Blake hesitated, then nodded. We thought she might be a suspect in an earlier case. We acted quickly. Acted quickly? Mike interjected. You didn't even ask her any questions. You just threw her to the ground and handcuffed her like she was some kind of criminal. Officer Carter stepped forward, trying to explain himself. We had to act fast, Lieutenant. We thought she might be involved in something serious. Taylor raised an eyebrow. Something serious? You don't arrest someone without any evidence or a reason. That's not how we do things. Mike stepped forward, positioning himself between the officers and the elderly woman. He was done letting them off easy. If you're going to arrest someone, you need to have a good reason. And this woman's only crime was sitting on a bench. The lieutenant's expression hardened. That's enough, he said. I'll handle this. You too. Step aside. Blake and Carter exchanged nervous glances before reluctantly stepping back. Taylor motioned for Mike to step aside as well, and Mike hesitated only for a moment before moving away. He wasn't done yet, but he knew that the right thing was happening now. Lieutenant Taylor's arrival had changed the dynamics. Mrs. Johnson, Taylor said softly, turning to the elderly woman still sitting on the ground. I'm so sorry for what you've been through. I'm going to make sure you're treated with respect from here on out. The crowd, still on edge, watched as Lieutenant Taylor ordered Blake and Carter to remove the handcuffs. As the cuffs were unlocked, Mrs. Johnson's face softened and tears welled in her eyes. She had been scared, humiliated, but now she could breathe again. Mike took a step closer, leaning down. Are you okay? He asked gently. Mrs. Johnson looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. I thought I was done for. Thank you for standing up for me. Mike smiled, offering a reassuring nod. You don't have to thank me. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter what. The crowd, which had been silently watching until now, erupted into applause. Cheers filled the air as the officers, now defeated, slowly turned and walked away. The atmosphere had changed from tension to relief in an instant. Lieutenant Taylor addressed the crowd, his voice firm and authoritative. What happened here today is unacceptable. This is not how we handle situations in this department. I'll be conducting a full review, and there will be consequences for those who broke the law. The crowd applauded again, sensing that real change might finally be on the horizon. Mike turned back to Mrs. Johnson, helping her to her feet. The ordeal wasn't over, but in that moment, justice had been served. Blake quickly explained. We thought she was a suspect from a previous incident. We acted on instinct. Lieutenant Taylor raised an eyebrow. Instinct? You threw her to the ground and handcuffed her without even asking any questions. Blake was caught off guard, his confidence faltering under the scrutiny. He had expected to explain away the situation with force, but Lieutenant Taylor wasn't buying it. Carter, usually the more vocal of the two officers, remained silent, his bravado evaporating. As the officers scrambled to justify their actions, Taylor's gaze shifted from them to Mike. Thank you for stepping in, Mr. Tyson, Taylor said, his tone softer now but still authoritative. I'll handle this from here. Mike nodded, but wasn't ready to back down. He wasn't just going to walk away after seeing what had unfolded. You should do more than just handle this. You should make sure this kind of thing never happens again, Mike said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of his experience and conviction. Lieutenant Taylor met Mike's gaze, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. The lieutenant didn't speak immediately, but the gravity of Mike's words was clear. He turned his attention back to the officers. Release her, Taylor ordered, his voice carrying the full authority of his rank. With a reluctant grunt, Blake stepped forward and unlocked the handcuffs. The moment the cuffs were removed, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate, and the crowd, who had been holding their breath, erupted into applause. The officer stood still, eyes cast downward, as Mrs. Johnson was finally free from the bonds that had been unjustly placed on her. Mike bent down, his usual intensity replaced by a quiet empathy. Are you okay? He asked gently, reaching out to help the elderly woman to her feet. Mrs. Johnson, still shaking from the ordeal, looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, unable to find words at first. She finally managed a whispered, "I'm just glad someone stood up for me." Mike's heart softened as he steadied her. "You deserve to be treated with respect," he said, his voice full of reassurance. He made sure she was standing firm, supporting her as they walked a few steps away from the scene. The crowd's applause continued to echo in the background. The officers stood silently, their faces unreadable as they processed a public shift in power. Blake and Carter had expected to dominate the situation, but Mike's intervention had turned the tables. What had begun as a routine exercise of authority had now become a public spectacle of injustice, and Mike had taken the stand. As Lieutenant Taylor moved toward the two officers, he didn't speak for a moment. His silence was enough to convey his displeasure. He knew that what had just happened was unacceptable, and the officers would have to face the consequences of their actions. Blake tried to speak, his voice shaky. "Lieutenant, we were just doing our job. We thought she was a woman from the case." Taylor held up a hand, silencing him. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to instill fear. You had no reason to arrest this woman. You didn't even try to talk to her, Blake. That's not how we do things." Blake's mouth opened, but no words came out. The realization that his actions were being scrutinized by both his superior and the public hit him hard. It wasn't just about his career. It was about his integrity. Carter stood beside him, looking at the ground, avoiding the lieutenant's gaze. The crowd had fallen silent, waiting for the next move. Taylor finally turned to face the officers fully, his expression stern. "I'll be reviewing this incident thoroughly, and there will be consequences. You too will be placed on administrative leave while the department conducts a full investigation." The crowd began murmuring again, but this time there was a sense of relief in the air. The officers had been called to account for their actions, and that was a victory in itself. Mike, sensing the shift, stepped forward once more. "This isn't just about today, Lieutenant. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. We need more transparency, more accountability. People need to trust the police, but it's hard to do that when things like this happen." Taylor's gaze was steady as he nodded. "I hear you, Mike. This kind of behavior has no place in our force. We'll make sure there's a full investigation, and we'll address the issues head on." Mike didn't fully relax, but he knew this was a step in the right direction. The changes wouldn't come overnight, but they had to start somewhere. As the scene wound down, the crowd began to disperse, many people still talking excitedly about what had just happened. Mike helped Mrs. Johnson find a bench where she could sit down and collect herself. He kept his distance, giving her space but ensuring she wasn't alone. His role in this moment hadn't just been about stepping in when he saw something wrong. It had been about standing up for justice in a world where it wasn't always guaranteed. Lieutenant Taylor approached the crowd, his demeanor still firm but with a touch of humility. "I know there are some of you here who are upset about what you witnessed today, and you should be. I'm here to assure you that this incident will be dealt with. We are committed to holding our officers accountable, and we will not tolerate abuse of power." The words were met with cautious optimism. People wanted to believe in the system, but they needed to see real change before they could trust it again. The lieutenant had made a promise, but it would take more than words to restore faith in the community. Mike looked over at Mrs. Johnson, who was still sitting on the bench, her hands folded in her lap. She looked calmer now, her breathing steadier. Mike gave her a reassuring smile, and for a moment, it felt like justice had been done. As they stood there, the last of the crowd slowly filtering out, Mike realized that this was just the beginning. The battle for justice, for equality, was never truly over. But today, he had made a difference, and that was a victory worth celebrating. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over the park. Mike took one last look around, his mind already turning to what needed to happen next. This wasn't just a story of one woman's fight for dignity. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The fight for justice wasn't just about confronting the obvious wrongs. It was about standing up when it mattered most, about refusing to let silence and fear hold back the truth. And Mike Tyson had made sure that, today, that truth was heard loud and clear. The scene was far from over. As the officers retreated, Mike turned to the crowd. His voice carried across the park, filling the space with a sense of urgency and resolve. What we witness here today was an abuse of power. An elderly woman was mistreated by those who are supposed to protect us. But when we stand together, we can stop injustice. His words echoed in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the event. There was a quiet power in his voice, a call to action that resonated deeply with the crowd. The people who had been standing on the sidelines, hesitant to get involved, now felt emboldened. They were no longer passive observers. They were part of something bigger, something important. Some had filmed the entire incident, and within minutes, the footage went viral. Social media platforms exploded with messages of support for Mike and condemnation of the officer's actions. The hashtags #JusticeForMartha and #StandWithMike spread like wildfire. People from all over the country, from all walks of life, began sharing the videos, expressing their outrage and their solidarity. By the time the evening news aired, the story had already become a sensation. Media outlets picked up the footage, and interviews with the crowd, including those who had witnessed the entire incident, flooded television screens and social media feeds. People were outraged by the police's overreach, but they were equally inspired by Mike's intervention. The footage didn't just capture a moment of police brutality. It captured something more. It captured the courage of one person standing up for what was right. It was a story of hope, a story of the powerless finding their voice, and a story of how one person could spark a movement. Lieutenant Taylor, his expression stern but thoughtful, spoke to the crowd. "This doesn't reflect the values of our department. I will personally oversee a full investigation. We will not tolerate this kind of behavior." His words were met with a mixture of applause and cautious optimism. People were grateful for the lieutenant's commitment to accountability, but they knew that real change required more than just promises. The public's trust in the police had been shaken, and it would take more than a single statement to restore it. Still, the fact that Lieutenant Taylor had acknowledged the wrongdoing was a significant step forward. For the first time in a long time, the community felt heard. They had seen one of their own stand up to the system, and now they were witnessing their leaders take responsibility. Mike didn't linger in the crowd for long after his statement. He had done what he needed to do, but he knew that the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. As he walked away from the park, he could hear the voices of the crowd behind him, still buzzing with conversation, still calling for justice. Their energy had shifted, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like something was about to change. The incident in Greenwood Park had brought the community together. It had given people the courage to speak out, to demand accountability. It was a moment that sparked a conversation about police reform, about human rights, and about the kind of world people wanted to live in. The next day, as Mike returned to the gym for another training session, he was greeted by a flood of messages. His phone was filled with texts, calls, and emails, all expressing gratitude for his actions. He had become a hero, not just for what he had done in the park, but for what he had represented. He had shown the world that it wasn't enough to stay silent in the face of injustice. One person could make a difference, and sometimes all it took was the courage to act. But Mike was no stranger to public attention. He had spent much of his life in the spotlight, both for his successes and his struggles. However, this time, it felt different. The support he was receiving wasn't about his fame or his achievements in the ring. It was about the stand he had taken for something bigger than himself. Meanwhile, in Greenwood Park, the community continued to rally around Mrs. Johnson. People from all walks of life came together to support her, offering their help in whatever way they could. Some brought her food, others helped with daily chores, and many simply offered words of comfort. It was a demonstration of the power of solidarity, a reminder that when people stand together, they are capable of great change. Mrs. Johnson, who had been shaken by the events of the day before, began to regain her strength. She was overwhelmed by the support she had received, but she also felt a renewed sense of hope. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she mattered, that her voice and her story were important. As the days went by, the story of Mike Tyson and Mrs. Johnson continued to spread, reaching even more people. News outlets featured interviews with Mrs. Johnson, and her courage in the face of adversity became an inspiration to others. People who had once been afraid to speak out now felt empowered to take action in their own communities. The local police department, under the leadership of Lieutenant Taylor, began to implement changes. Officers attended sensitivity training, and new procedures were put in place to ensure that incidents like the one in Greenwood Park would never happen again. It was a long road ahead, but the first steps had been taken. As the weeks passed, the community's sense of unity continued to grow. People realized that real change was possible, but it required persistence, courage, and a collective will. It wasn't just about one event or one person. It was about the power of the community to come together and demand a better future for all. Mike Tyson's actions had not only changed the course of one woman's life, but had also ignited a spark that would lead to a larger movement for justice. It was proof that standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult, could have a ripple effect that changed the world for the better. As the days passed, the story continued to unfold. Blake and Carter were placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The pressure on the police department was mounting, and the community demanded accountability. Mike Tyson's actions had sparked a movement, and the eyes of the world were now on Greenwood Park and the officers involved. Mike's stand against injustice had become a symbol of courage and justice, inspiring others to speak up when they saw wrongdoing. People who had once stayed silent in the face of abuse of power now found their voices. Mike had shown them that standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy, could lead to real change. The videos of the incident, coupled with the testimonies of Mike and Mrs. Johnson, revealed the officers' misconduct. The footage, shared across social media platforms, quickly went viral. People saw the truth of what had happened, and the calls for justice grew louder. The outpouring of support for Mrs. Johnson and for Mike's intervention was overwhelming. As the investigation into Blake and Carter continued, more information came to light. It was revealed that both officers had multiple prior complaints regarding the abuse of power. These complaints had been ignored or dismissed, buried under the weight of departmental politics. But now, the public outcry could no longer be ignored. The misconduct of these officers was no longer a secret, and it couldn't be swept under the rug. The disciplinary committee, after reviewing the evidence, recommended that Blake and Carter be dismissed from the police force. The investigation had uncovered their history of abusive behavior, and the officers' actions on that day in Greenwood Park were the final straw. The committee also recommended that criminal charges be brought against the officers for their unlawful use of force and violation of Mrs. Johnson's rights. The news of the disciplinary actions against Blake and Carter spread quickly. It was a victory for the community, but it was also a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. The public's demand for reform within the police force was gaining momentum. It was clear that this incident was not just about two rogue officers. It was about a larger systemic issue that needed to be addressed. People rallied for reform, calling for greater accountability within law enforcement. The pressure on the police department to make real, lasting changes was immense. Mike Tyson became an advocate for change, attending community meetings, speaking at rallies, and urging everyone to continue fighting for justice. His involvement in the cause gave the movement a powerful voice, and his experience in the spotlight helped bring attention to the issue. Change doesn't happen overnight, Mike said during a public speech, but it starts with us. It starts with us standing up, speaking out, and making sure that we hold the people in power accountable. His words resonated with the crowd, and as the weeks passed, more and more people joined the movement for reform. The rallying cry for justice spread far beyond Greenwood Park, and it became clear that Mike Tyson's actions had sparked a national conversation about police brutality and accountability. In Greenwood Park, life slowly returned to normal. Mrs. Johnson, who had been so deeply affected by the incident, began to heal. The support from the community helped her regain a sense of dignity and self-worth. She often spoke at local events, sharing her story and urging people to stand up against injustice. She became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that one person's courage could make a difference. As the investigation into the officers continued, Mike remained in close contact with the community. He was involved in organizing meetings with local leaders and law enforcement, pushing for better training, greater transparency, and stronger measures to ensure that incidents like the one in Greenwood Park would never happen again. The police department, under the pressure of public scrutiny, began to take steps toward reform. Lieutenant Taylor, who had been supportive of Mike's intervention, played a key role in pushing for changes within the department. He worked with community leaders and advocates to develop new policies aimed at preventing abuse of power and improving the relationship between law enforcement and the community. It wasn't an easy process, but the changes were starting to take root. New training programs were implemented, focusing on de-escalation tactics, cultural awareness, and ethics. Officers were required to undergo regular evaluations to ensure they were adhering to the department's standards of conduct. A new civilian oversight committee was established to monitor complaints against officers, ensuring that investigations were independent and impartial. The public pressure didn't let up. The media continued to cover the story, and the hashtags #JusticeForMartha and #StandWithMike remained trending topics. People from all over the country continued to rally behind Mike, Mrs. Johnson, and the cause for justice. The movement had become a force to be reckoned with. As the weeks turned into months, the police department began to see a shift in public perception. While there was still work to be done, the changes made were a step in the right direction. Mike Tyson's role in bringing attention to the issue of police brutality had been pivotal, and the ripple effect of his actions continued to be felt across the nation. For Mike, this wasn't just a moment of victory. It was a beginning of a long-term commitment to fighting for justice. He had seen firsthand the power of one individual's actions to make a difference, and he was determined to continue pushing for change. Justice had been served in Greenwood Park, but the fight for equality and accountability was far from over. Mike Tyson had sparked a movement, and the community, united in their call for justice, was ready to continue the fight for a better future. In the weeks that followed, the police department, under the leadership of Lieutenant Taylor, began implementing comprehensive reforms. Blake and Carter's dismissal was just the beginning. Lieutenant Taylor knew that for real change to happen, it couldn't stop with just one incident or two officers. The department needed to take a hard look at its practices and make sure that its officers were held to the highest standards. All officers were required to undergo mandatory training on professional ethics, cultural awareness, and nonviolent crisis intervention. This was a critical step toward ensuring that future incidents of abuse of power would be prevented. Officers learned how to handle tense situations without escalating them, how to treat people with dignity and respect, and how to be more mindful of their own biases. These programs became a cornerstone of the department's new approach to policing. A new complaint system was introduced, allowing citizens to report abuse anonymously, ensuring transparency and accountability. The system was designed to make it easier for people to come forward with their concerns without fear of retaliation. The department also set up a civilian oversight committee to review all complaints and ensure that investigations were thorough and unbiased. Mike Tyson, though not officially part of the police force, became a vocal advocate for reform. His role as a community leader grew, and he used his platform to speak out at numerous gatherings, urging everyone to stand up against injustice. Mike spoke passionately about the need for systemic change and the importance of community involvement in policing. He believed that real reform could only happen if people worked together to hold the system accountable. "Change starts with us," Mike said at one of his speeches. "We can't keep sitting by and hoping someone else will fix things. If we want a better world, we've got to make it happen ourselves." Mrs. Martha Johnson, now fully recovered, often joined Mike at these events, sharing her experience and encouraging others to do the same. Her voice, once silenced by fear and intimidation, now resonated with power and determination. She became an important symbol of the movement for justice and reform, a living example of what could happen when people spoke up and stood their ground. "I never thought I'd see the day when I would be treated with respect again," Mrs. Johnson said during one of her speeches. "Mike helped me regain my faith in humanity. He gave me my dignity back. I want everyone to know that no matter what happens, you are worth standing up for. Don't let anyone take that from you." Her words were a powerful reminder that even the smallest act of kindness, even the smallest gesture of support, could make a world of difference. Mrs. Johnson's courage in the face of injustice had inspired so many others to stand up, speak out, and demand change. The story of Mike and Mrs. Johnson spread across the country, inspiring a movement for justice and reform. It wasn't just about the police department in Greenwood Park anymore. It was about the entire country, about all of the places where people had been wronged by the system and had no one to turn to. Mike's act of standing up for what was right had sparked a national conversation about police brutality, racial inequality, and the need for real reform. In cities across the nation, people began to organize protests, rallies, and town hall meetings to discuss the future of policing. New organizations were formed to help victims of police abuse find their voices, and many of those organizations found inspiration in Mike and Mrs. Johnson's story. They were proof that change was possible, that one person's courage could spark a wave of transformation. For Mike, this movement became more than just a chapter in his life. It became his new purpose. He worked tirelessly to bring attention to the issues facing his community, traveling the country to speak at rallies and meetings. He used his fame and influence to push for reform and to inspire others to join the fight for justice. Mike had once been known for his fierce presence in the boxing ring, but now he was known for his fierce commitment to making the world a better place. Mike's efforts didn't go unnoticed. He was invited to speak before lawmakers and community leaders, advocating for police reform and changes to the criminal justice system. His voice carried weight, and people listened. He was no longer just a famous boxer. He had become a leader in the fight for equality and justice. As the months passed, the reforms within the police department began to take shape. The officers who had once been involved in abuse of power were now under constant scrutiny, and the department worked hard to prove that it was committed to serving the community with integrity. While it wasn't a perfect system, the progress was undeniable. The new policies created a sense of accountability that had been sorely lacking in the past. The local community, once divided, began to unite around the cause for justice. People from all walks of life came together to support the reforms, recognizing that their collective voice had the power to bring about change. The bond between Mike, Mrs. Johnson, and the community grew stronger as they continued to fight for a better future. Mike's work was far from over, but he had already made a significant impact. The changes that had begun in Greenwood Park were only the beginning of a much larger movement. His legacy was no longer just about the championships he had won in the ring. It was about the changes he had fought for in his community, and the lives he had touched along the way. Mike Tyson's act of standing up for what was right had made a lasting impact on his community and on the world. It had shown everyone that even in the face of adversity, one person's courage could spark a wave of change. His legacy would live on, not through his victories in the ring, but through the justice he had fought for, the lives he had inspired, and the reforms he had helped bring to life. The fight for justice was ongoing, but with the community united and the reforms in place, it was clear that the future was brighter than ever.